All right, so I have promised to introduce today's topic, and the speakers will be hearing about the Finnish Association for Conciliatory Journalists and about some case examples of how conciliatory journalism has been put to practice here in Finland. In the first Nordic Forum event in September, I talked about the conciliatory journalism action research project that Laura and myself carried out in 2016 to 2018. And I hope, of course, that many of you were present already back then, but in any case, the talk is still available on our forum's website as a YouTube video, so you can go there and check out the first forum talk for the basics of how conciliatory journalism was born and the background for that project. I talked about the context of this idea that we call conciliatory journalism. I introduced the starting point for the research project, the social context where we felt the need to address the problem of social polarization, and the theoretical background that we did in that project. But after that first forum talk, we got some feedback here in our discussions that people would like to hear more about the practical journalistic projects that we've been doing, that the journalists, the conciliatory journalists have carried out. So what does conciliatory journalism actually look like? And that's what Noora Kettunen and Matleena Ylikoski will talk about today. And you see the pictures here. They are all kind of examples of journalistic stories that have been carried out under the label of conciliatory journalism. But before I give floor to them, I will briefly give a little recap on the term conciliatory journalism. In the last meeting in January in this forum, we ended up talking quite a bit about the terminology that we use in different countries and the possible questions and even critique that may arise from talking about constructive journalism, solutions orientation, trust journalism, or in our case, conciliatory journalism. And I thought that it's best to say a few words about why we call it that, conciliatory. In Finnish, of course, we talk about sovittelujournalismi. Sovittelu means conflict mediation or medling på svenska. And by this, we do not mean that we want journalists to take responsibility as mediators in the conflicts that they report, but rather we refer to the theoretical and practical background that we used in developing the methods for journalists to encounter social conflicts and to deal with the parties involved in those conflicts. So when we started to write about it in English, we didn't want to call it mediator journalism or mediation journalism. We tried to find a term that would be more original and also better suit, better describe what the journalists seek to achieve with the public discussion that they are opening up with this kind of journalism. So we ended up calling it conciliatory because we found this dictionary definition that you see on the slide there, and we quite like the formulation where it says that it's inviting people to a party you're having and about trying to make them less angry. And we thought that it captured quite well the sentiment in our workshops with the journalists where we developed the idea, the basic motivation of this kind of multi-perspective, dialogic, contextualizing approaches that these journalists kind of strived for in their own experiments. So I want to stress here that it's important to understand that conciliatory doesn't mean that the goal is to resolve conflicts. The goal is not to downplay the conflicts or to find solutions to them or to define whose argument should win. Our approach is that conflicts in society are not a problem, but dealing with them badly is. So to better deal with conflicts, we turn to conflict mediation and restorative dialogue. And through these, we wanted to use the actual practices of preparing encounters, focusing on listening, making sure that people are correctly understood, and so on. But also, we kind of took in the principles, the more abstract goals of restorative encounters as maintaining mutual respect between diverse social groups. Well, after our project then, and already during it, Sopiva was founded. Sopiva is the Association for Conciliatory Journalists that now serves as a platform for journalists and researchers who wish to carry the torch, who want to apply in practice and further develop the principles of conciliatory journalism. Noora Kettunen here was the founder of Sopiva and continues to actively develop new forms of action for conciliatory journalism. She's a freelance journalist, and she works part-time at YLE, the Finnish broadcasting company, and also for magazines here. And Matleena Ylikoski is a journalist who has also been actively along in Sopiva since the very first workshops of the project. And she's a journalist who has worked in local newspapers and YLE also, and as a freelancer. But at the moment, Matleena is doing her doctoral thesis in the University of Tampere. And her subject is diversity in journalism. So after this long introduction, I will now give the floor to them so they can tell you more about how they are doing conciliatory journalism and what it means in practice. Over to you guys.
So thank you, and hello to everybody on my behalf too. The cases that we will introduce now are the story that Noora wrote about Roma people that had stayed in Helsinki during Corona pandemic, and my story about climate change and its consequences in the local level. Both stories were born during workshops that Sopiva organized last autumn. The two separate workshops were about how to cover climate change and Roma people responsibly, so that the stories wouldn't deepen the conflicts that are already there, but would help to understand new perspectives to these issues. These both workshops gathered 10 to 15 journalists to discover this topic together.
So when we do conciliatory journalism, we think carefully at every point of the process and how the different choices that we make affect whether the article strengthens the conflict in question or brings more nuances and understanding to it. So first, I thought of choosing the viewpoint that would not be for the Roma people or against the Roma people. And this article was published in a Finnish magazine called Menaiset as Women. And I wanted to introduce a dilemma that invites people to reflect and consider the issue.
About the interviewees then, generally I don't choose extreme voices to my stories, but someone who represents the silent majority between the extreme voices. And I will choose as many interviewees as possible, and I try to make sure that they are all able to discuss constructively about the issue. And many times this requires long discussions beforehand. Finding interviewees is sometimes really hard and time consuming. For example, in a climate change story, the climate change doesn't really address the silent majority, at least in the local level, and finding people was hard. Finally, I found two local politicians from the right-wing True Finns party and left-wing Green party, and two other persons. One of them was a farmer and another worked in the Finnish Defense Forces. So people from very different backgrounds. Despite of differences, this local context of village of Petäjävesi, where we all live, was common to all of us. And this gave a lot of room for common experiences and also common worries. And it was a constructive base for the conversation.
And another point to consider is how do I interact with the interviewees as a journalist? Starting from, are we on the same status? Are we on the same level? How do I dress? In this case, I didn't wear a mask all the time. It was based on if the translators said that now we should wear a mask, and I wanted to be as approachable as possible. So at every stage we can build the trust between journalists and interviewees. And it's also important, if possible, give time and meet several times in order to build the trust and show that this story is important. And also words and concepts, which words do we choose? It's also very important aside. And for example, on the Roma issue, they are often referred to in articles as Roma beggars, even though all of them do not beg. And now it's been introduced that the better term would be Roma immigrant. And it's also important to discuss which terms we agree to, and if we disagree on some words, why is that so?
So then in the interview situation, I try to facilitate careful listening between all parties. Many times I interview the people together to build a real conversation between the parties. In the case of climate change story, I organized 2 separate interviews for the politicians and for the others. The Green Party politician didn't like this arrangement first. He had a feeling that I intentionally built a confrontation between them, and it took a while to explain my real motivation. I've realized that being open as a journalist and explaining the journalistic decisions helps to build trust between me and the interviewees. And then in the actual interview situation, the first step towards constructive discussion is a mutual understanding of what exactly we are talking about and where the disagreements lie. All parties should have the feeling that they have been heard and understood correctly, even when they are challenged. In this case, all interviewees appeared to be non-stereotypical people. The true Finn and the Green politician, they agreed in almost everything, which was really surprising. And the farmer was the greenest activist in this group. So if I had had a strong stereotype of what kind of people they are, it would have been really hard to write a truthful story about the conversation. In general, it's really important to deliver the dialogue also into the article. In my case, as there was not a real disagreement or fight about the climate change, I couldn't focus on clarifying the conflict as I had prepared. Instead, I decided to focus on the different consequences of climate change in our local context, and then put these people to discuss in these teams. I tried to select 1 citation from each person to all themes to make it as multi-perspective as possible. And I also wanted to repeat the real dialogue between interviewees whenever possible. So in the end, there were lots of citations in the story and not so much my own writing. What was interesting was that I gave the whole story to all of them to read beforehand, and I asked to correct any citation if needed. 3 of them didn't correct any of them, and only 1 completed his citations, and I let him to do it. I know that many journalists don't want people to read their articles beforehand, but I think that it's an important part of socially responsible journalism.
And it's good for journalists to interact also with the photographer, like in this case it was a photographer, on how do we visualize a certain story and how do we visualize these people. Do we show them as active or passive? Are they smiling? Are they looking serious? In which kind of places we picture them? And in this case, these photos were being suggested from the magazine, but they were very open to change them when I said that I want to show them in a different light. I want to show them as active people, as something that they are showing. Okay, I'm holding this phone to video call with my family, and that they are smiling. And since this piece was focused on what brings these people hope during this difficult corona time and what brings joy to their lives, that this helps to relate to these people, that they are not so different, even though many of their experiences are not something that we share.
And then finally, we also must pay attention to what happens after publishing the story. It's truly important that the interviewees are not left alone with the consequences of the article. We have to prove people that journalism is a fair and a safe forum of public discussion. And that means, for example, that we have to moderate the discussion that takes place in the comments of the article and also in the social media if possible. And we have created moderation principles that support a constructive debate on internet. And we can also keep in touch with the interviewee and see how she or he is doing after the story. And our experience about the audience's reactions to conciliatory journalism is twofold. Sometimes it creates good and varied comment. People want to, for example, add one more perspective to the issue, but not always so much feedback is given. Many times people simply say that, oh, this was a good multi-perspective article, I liked it. And that was the case also with my climate change article. The interviewees were happy with the story and they commented that you wrote exactly how I said. Well, that's not so surprising, or is it?
One thing that we have also been thinking about a lot lately, it is what is the motivation to take part in public discussion on a conflicted issue. And many times the Roma people, for example, are being framed as either a threat to the society, maybe they are criminals, maybe they are aggressively begging, or they are seen as victims, these poor people that we need to help. But it will be important to think and maybe also research on how the journalists could prevent hate speech and negative publicity, and is it possible?
So here was our part. I hope that you got ideas of how we are doing this conciliatory journalism, and Laura can continue from this.
Okay, thank you, Matleena, Noora, and Mikko.